You did a lot of combat in this movie.
I did
I
it
didn't
all,
know
yeah.
that you were quite. You do punching bags and you do karate kicks on the punching bag. And
I
whatever.
had no idea I was as violent as I guess I am.
Menagerie parody isn't the first time that a female character has had the traits of what we now know as the Mary Sue today, but it is obviously more prominent now than it ever has been. I think a pretty big reason for this complete takeover of insufferable female characters has its roots planted from a more political place like the 60s and the 70s with the mass production of birth control and the Supreme Court decision on Roe v. Wade. The impact that those historic moments had on our culture led to a chain of events popularizing the types of stories our media companies make today. Perhaps even further back than birth control with events like women's suffrage, or maybe even before with the industrialization age of the Western world. But that kind of history lesson is for another video, where perhaps someone can dive deeply into the successes and failures of the feminist movement of the last century and how that's played out in our pop culture and cinema. For now, let's just stick within the confines of Hollywood and its recent history. I think the portrayal of the strong female character trope in modern cinema started to really take hold in the 80s and the 90s and was basically par for the course by the early 2000s. Let me give you an example. When I was growing up, my stay-at-home sick movies that weren't Star Wars always seemed to be action-packed and full of heroes. Die Hard, Lethal Weapon, and Predator are just a few examples, but one movie stood above the rest, and I must have watched this movie almost as much as I did Empire Strikes Back. And that's Aliens. Now don't worry, I'm not gonna knock Ellen Ripley, she's badass, but it started to become obvious that something was changing in 80s movies. Almost all of cinema, up to and through the 1970s, where women were mostly portrayed as characters that are a love interest for the hero or a victim for the antagonists, was starting to shift. Obviously, we had Ellen Ripley in 1979 and we had Princess Leia in 1977, but it was the 80s that truly had widely marketable and interesting female leads, if not somewhat unbelievable. We began to see scenes in movies of women learning how to use a gun, for instance, or drive a car during an intense moment better than expected. The female character might have had a monologue about the difficulties of being a woman, or might have had a scene where the man sits dumbfounded as he's put in his place by the leading actress. It didn't mean that 007 was about to be female or something like that, but that there would be moments throughout the film where a woman would have her time to shine. Aliens is this in spades, having 4 strong female characters, all of which are stronger than the next, like Dietrich, the Marine medic, or Pharaoh, the Marine pilot. Then there's Vasquez, one of the baddest chicks that I've ever seen on screen to this day. Tough, capable, violent, brave, and loyal. I was impressed. It's all a bit unbelievable now when I watch it again.
He just too bad.
But I sure loved this character when I was a kid.
Hey, I'm impressed.
Then there's Ripley. She's smart, pretty, capable, and motherly, and could have easily fit the role that most women did fit prior to the 1970s, but for one minor difference. She kills xenomorphs by the dozens. Female characters were starting to change. And look, maybe it was time to, and maybe there was a legitimate gripe about women only being able to play one role in action films. But looking back, one thing was really clear. Despite how strong these female characters were, they weren't Mary Sue's, not completely at least. They made mistakes, they had flaws, and often needed to be saved and helped by their male counterparts. And in most cases, they had something undeniably feminine about them that helped to round out their character as both hero and damsel. And most importantly, this 80s version of a strong female character was rare. By the time we got to the 90s, however, the strong female character portrayed so well by Ripley and Connor were starting to phase out, along with the macho 80s action hero. Box office hits of the 90s were starting to step away from the overly macho to the seemingly more female approachable stories in movies like Titanic, Jurassic Park, Twister, Ghost, Notting Hill, The Lion King, and Independence Day, just to name a few. These box office titans might have had male leads, but the female characters in these movies were far from being supporting roles, and often they share the screen with their co-stars equally.
God creates dinosaurs. God destroys dinosaurs. God creates man. Man destroys God. Man creates dinosaurs.
Dinosaurs eat man. woman inherits the earth.
They may not have been full-blown Mary Sues yet, but actresses like Sandra Bullock got their start as a leading actress because of their modern woman dialogue.
Well, if you had read my study, you would know that this is how insecure heterosexual males used to bond.
Alongside their leading male co-stars, while still maintaining their perceived femininity. From Demolition Man and Speed to Miss Congeniality and the Divine Secrets of the Ya-Ya Sisterhood, actresses like Sandra Bullock were the bridge between believable female heroes to unbelievable and insufferable superwomen, a phenomenon that I'm dubbing the Sandra Bullock Bridge. We weren't quite at the full-blown Mary Sue just yet. Women still needed to be saved from time to time, but the male and female actors started to share the screen in most films nearly equally, despite who the hero was supposed to be. It's also a time when many modern political messages made their way into films where the story specifically panders to controversial ideas of the time, like women in the workplace or women's sexual freedom, or even women's right to choose. Things were starting to evolve. The Sandra Bullock Bridge brought us from rare badass women that used their believable and feminine traits to be the hero of the story to right at the door of pure political and female pandering.
Don't go away, because Robotech's coming right back.
But then something happened in the early 2000s that, in my opinion, was the single hardest shift in how female characters were portrayed on screen. This single and massively important event signaled to Hollywood that it was time to put the men in the back seat and let the women take the wheel. Okay, it's hard to properly put into words just how rare and incredible the success of the Harry Potter movies actually was. 8 movies that came out within 10 years, starring child actors, utilizing multiple directors, and competing with the likes of Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, and Marvel. The Harry Potter movies are truly an impressive feat. But right from the beginning, something was introduced that would control the narrative of filmmaking in Hollywood for the next 2 decades. And that's what I'm calling...
You've got dirt on your nose, by the way. Did you know? Just there.
A few months ago, I decided to reread the Harry Potter books for the first time since the last book's release. I was actually pretty excited because I wanted to know how my perspective had changed over the last 16 years. How would I see the characters as an older adult that has that 16 years worth of literature and life experience under my belt? Who would my favorite characters be? How would I feel about the adults in the book now that I'm a father? It was all very interesting to me. Well, I did realize something. Actually, I realized 2 things that changed the way that I looked at the franchise forever. The first thing I realized is, besides the final book, which does feel a little bit rushed, I was amazed at how good the story actually holds up. It is a modern marvel of the hero's journey and has a timeless feel to it that can really only be created through deep understanding of what the hero's journey actually is. Harry Potter is a nearly perfect hero because he's not perfect at all. He's kind of obnoxious, actually, in his decision-making and his emotional behavior. And more often than not, he's a jerk to the people around him. Like young King Arthur, he believes that he's a nobody and the home that he lives in helps to cement this idea and makes him a better man for it. It isn't until Harry, like Arthur, is introduced to the magical world where he is the chosen one that he understands how important everyone seems to think that he is. I honestly had an amazing time rereading these books, but as I was rereading the first book, I realized that something was off that I hadn't quite caught before. Which leads me to the second thing that I noticed. Something in these books just wasn't adding up to the way that I remembered the characters because the last time that I enjoyed anything Harry Potter related, I was watching the movies with my kids. Now, I'm not sure when my last viewing of the Harry Potter movies was prior to having reread the books, but whenever it was, it had a lasting effect on how I perceived the characters. A perception that seemed to supersede my perception of the book versions of the characters. Bringing it back to the point that I'm trying to make, when I finished the first book this time, I remembered something that I hadn't thought about in 2 decades. Ron used to be my favorite character, and I had completely forgotten it. Now, if you've never read the books, then it's hard to understand what I'm talking about because Ron is such a crappy character in the movies. Often, he's petrified of whatever scary situation the trio experiences, and oftentimes, he's the butt of the joke in just about every scene that he clumsily finds himself in. He's not as brave as Harry or Hermione, not as smart, good-looking, popular, charismatic, or even as rich as his counterparts, and the movies work pretty hard to maintain that narrative. The movie version of Ronald Weasley simply just doesn't belong amongst these mighty heroes, but the books are very different in their presentation of Harry's red-headed ally. Ron is oftentimes braver than Harry and far more loyal than Hermione. He's stoic, described as nearly as intelligent as Harry, a good duelist, and is the best friend a guy can have when going up against a villain like Voldemort. Ron is also remarkably humble when considering that he's best friends with the most famous wizard in the wizarding world and also best friends with the smartest student at Hogwarts. It takes 4 years for his humble nature to finally crack from his teenage jealousy, living in the shadow of his family and his peers. Honestly, Ron is a wonderfully written character. He was even polled as most people's favorite character, if you can believe it, before the first movie was released. So what happened? Well, I think you know where I'm going from here. If you think about it, it's pretty incredible how forgiving everyone was with the Harry Potter movies and what they did to Ron's character. But I just don't think that most of us had our eyes opened yet. I don't think that audiences, especially male audiences, knew that through Hermione, the beginning of character assassinations would start to happen. Characters from every single major franchise would be affected, and it all started right here, the Hermione bomb. Now you might be thinking, I understand what you're talking about with Ron's movie character versus his book character, but what does that have to do with Hermione? Well, my friend, indulge me for just a few more minutes while I explain. You see, in writing, there is a reason why they say 90% of writing is rewriting, and it's because most of what we write is garbage. Editing exists to strengthen the characters and the events that happen in the books we read and the movies that we watch. These stories are often refined to such a point that it's typically only a handful of events in a story that create the personality of each character. It only takes a few scenes and a few lines, for instance, to know what kind of character Bender is in the John Hughes classic The Breakfast Club.
Excuse me a second. What are you babbling about?
It's actually pretty easy to figure out each of these characters within the first 5 minutes of the film. What makes Ron's character in the books so incredible is the few moments where he showcases loyalty, bravery, and a pretty good moral standing when faced with difficult and dangerous situations.
Not me, not Hermione, you.
But that's the book. For whatever weird and self-righteous reason, the writer of the movie versions of the Harry Potter characters decided to take almost all of Ron's brave, moral, and loyal lines and actions and give them to Hermione instead.
For a man to like her best was arguably unusual.
That's right. Somebody deliberately stole Ron's best and bravest moments and gave them to Hermione instead. It's a really weird thing to do. Unfortunately, today's cinema does this all the time, but I really do think that it all began right here with these movies. Not that the Mary Sue character didn't exist before, but that in a movie series that generated over $7 billion in a 10-year period, it's no surprise that the floodgates were open to write this kind of character and everything. What I'm trying to say is that the incentive had changed. The Hermione bomb signaled to studios and to screenwriters that the female characters no longer needed flaws and that their strengths can be at the expense of the male characters around them. The message seemed to be, make more Hermiones and you'll make billions. And we were blind. Not everybody, mind you, but the public at large was blind. You could even argue that Hermione is not a main character, so it's forgivable, because Harry is still the chosen one. That we got an on-screen series of movies that were taken seriously by a studio that created them. And we hadn't seen character assassinations of this kind to this level in a movie franchise before. That the audience can hardly be blamed. What happened to Ron's character and how it benefited Hermione is the standard issue of affairs in today's movies. I mean, she steals his lines in this scene, this one, this one, this one, and even in this one.
If you want to kill Harry, you'll have to kill us too.
And that's just scratching the surface. What made Hermione's character so good in the books is that she was flawed. But it wasn't just that she was flawed, but that she was flawed in the most feminine ways. She was emotional and easily hurt by the words and actions of her friends. She expected Ron to make the first move to romantically progress a relationship because there was this sense of traditionalism that existed in her personality. She becomes easily jealous of girls that she feels are better looking than her, and she still does petty things to those girls that she doesn't like. She's just like a normal high school girl. I always felt that her character was written in a way that only another woman could write. These movies, however, read more like a fan fiction, where the writer's placeholder fantasies for Hermione's character made it on screen. All of Ron's and Hermione's strengths roll in Hermione, while Ron gets left with only his flaws and Hermione loses all of hers. Like I said, these scenes were hardly discovered by me. People have noticed Ron's character assassination for 20 years, but I'm taking it a step further. The Hermione bomb changed cinema for the decades to come, because what was once a fringe trope hardly used in film, the Mary Sue character was now on full display in Harry Potter, and would be the foundation of storytelling in Hollywood until today. Once my brain connected the dots, I realized that there was no greater or more profitable success in film at the change of the millennium than the Harry Potter series. I mean, think about it. All the movies in the last 20 years that have come out, especially ones based on books, where the hero is put in extraordinary situations like a hopeless survival movie or a dangerous love story, are more often than not a Mary Sue story with a female lead. The success of Hermione is, from what I can tell, the single greatest catalyst that led to this insufferable phenomenon. I'm the Germexican, and I hope that I've earned your subscription today. God bless. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.